Hello and welcome back. We're continuing talking about what sort of things are ethical to sell, and we're talking about sex work. So we saw Martha Nussbaum's uh, argument that sex work should be legal and under certain circumstances can be moral. Now we're going to see Scott Anderson's argument against Nussbaum's viewpoint, uh, and the article is called Prostitution and Sexual Autonomy. So you may have noticed, usually in my lectures, I'll have like little pictures to sort of have a visual element. I just didn't know how to do it with these lectures because I don't want to just have pictures of sex workers over and over. Feels a little exploitative or something. So um, we're just going to keep with the text with this one and with the ideas. Uh, so Anderson characterizes the debate, uh, in what Nussbaum does as well. Uh, but he puts names on the two camps. So one camp he calls the liberals, so that would include Nussbaum. Um, and liberals argue that legalizing sex work can increase women's autonomy by giving them, one more option of what they can do with their body to earn money. Um, Typically, that's how we think of autonomy is just having more options, having more, being able to do more, right? So it seems like, well, legalize it, women can do more things. Um, And Nussbaum then goes on to argue that, sex work in principle is no different than any of the other types of work that we might do with our bodies if we were to get rid of what she argues are irrational prejudices against sex work. The other camp, Anderson calls the radical feminists, and this group, is sort of a broad umbrella. Um, but in general, these folks argue that sex work is a manifestation of male domination. It reinforces male domination, and it's inherently wrong. It wouldn't exist outside of a unjust system. So Anderson is going to be arguing on behalf of the radical feminists. He's going to be trying to, take their argument a step further in a direction that it hasn't been yet. And so he does agree that the radical feminists haven't quite adequately or strongly enough made their point, explaining why sex work is, in fact, more objectionable than any of the other practices that are involved in a male-dominated society. So, as we discussed in the other lectures, um, sex work is one way that women are, sort of held inferior to men, and that their bodies can be, bought and sold. Uh, but arguably, marriage is another such institution, right? And no one is really arguing to make marriage illegal or that marriage is immoral, right? And these are all tied up in the same patriarchal system. So what makes sex work special, right? Anderson doesn't think the radical feminists have quite made that case adequately yet. Um, Anderson proposes to do this by countering Nussbaum's suggestion, because Nussbaum explicitly says, um, yes, sex isn't that special, right? It's just a sort of a prejudice we have, and that if we got rid of that prejudice, then it would be no worse than singing in a nightclub or, acting or any of the things that, people in the Victorian era thought were terrible and immoral. Um, but Anderson wants to say, no, there is something special about sex, and he thinks that he can explain what that is, right? And if we can understand why sex is an exception, right, why it's not like other kinds of work, um, then maybe we can also understand why he and the radical feminists think that legalizing sex work would actually make things worse for women and not better. So Anderson goes on to elaborate what he calls the radical feminist position. So, um, as we said, feminists have argued against sex work on the grounds that it supports a broader structure of male domination, right? So, and it's wrong because it participates and reinforces that system, and in fact is inextricable from the system of power relations. So it's not as simple as, well, if I want to sell, sexual service, isn't that my right as a free individual? The feminists say, no, you have to look at the bigger picture, right? It's all wrapped up in this system, and it's bad because it's part of that system. So these claims entail that. So this is a system, if this is a system that sort of keeps women inferior and degrades them, um, then it follows that engaging in sex work is engaging in your own degradation. And as an example of what that looks like, Anderson quotes Andrea Dworkin at length in a passage where she describes in detail. So she is Andrea Dworkin is an activist and a writer, and has at one point been a sex worker. And so from experience, she describes what that looks like in fairly harrowing detail. Um, but it gives you a sense of why folks like her think that the job is that sort of work is inherently degrading. Anderson grants there might be exceptions, right? There may be sex workers in the world that don't find it degrading, or do sex work that is somehow less degrading. Um, but that's not exactly the point. The point is more that, according to Dworkin and others, degradation is what men are buying when they buy sex from women, right? They're buying the power dynamic, right? More than any particular service. Another claim made by feminist critics of sex work is that because the work is inherently degrading, as they've argued, then no rational person would ever choose to do it if they had another option. Right? Now, of course, some rational women do choose to do it, right, in this world. But the feminists argue that is just more evidence that the system is unjust, right? That those women's options are so limited that they have been driven to this degrading work, right, in order to survive. And this fits in empirically with what we see of women, being on average poorer, more frequently victims of violence of many kind, including sexual violence. So, in a society where it's harder for women to make it, it's perhaps not surprising that some will be driven to take jobs that, if they had other options, they would not. And finally, again, this is Anderson characterizing what he calls the radical feminist position. Um, they claim that sex work perpetuates the power imbalance between the genders by reinforcing these stereotypes about women as sex objects that are sort of degraded to be bought and sold, to be used at will. Uh, in our society, I mean, sex work is tolerated, right? It's something actually that men want, but they also want it kept underground and illegal, so as to not um, allow that sort of sexual freedom to become more commonplace. It needs to be kept within certain bounds, right? Um, and all the movies and jokes and sort of titillating imaginations, fantasies about sex workers, um, all in general, implicitly are aimed at all women, is the claim, right? So to joke about or laugh about prostitutes is implicitly to joke or laugh about women in general. Okay, so that was the radical feminist position. Now he goes on to describe the liberal position, which again you've seen if you've read the Nussbaum, right? Um, and liberals can agree with much of this, right? I mean, they don't think that it's good that women, they agree that yes, that we're in a sort of patriarchal society and that women that degrades women. Um, but nonetheless, the liberals will say something like, legalizing prostitution is sort of a lesser evil, right? In a bad situation, we can make things a little better for some women by not, also throwing them in jail on top of all the other things that they have to do to survive, right? Again, they say, look, for some women in certain situations, sex work is their best option. They can make more money. They can potentially survive. And making it illegal is only going to make that worse. Not only will they potentially end up in jail, but they're also outside of the protection of the law, outside of the safeguards of, legal employment. There's certain, there's government standards for your safety and health and things like that. But if you're involved in an illicit trade, none of that exists for you. Liberals will sometimes also argue that there's not one kind of sex work. It's not just this right? The streetwalker, right? It is, you know, a wide variety of different types of sex work. Arguably, not all forms are necessarily degrading or exploitative. Um, I don't know much about it, but I'm aware of something called OnlyFans, where people seem to make money with some sort of explicit video stuff. Maybe that's a form of sex work that is somehow less degrading. I don't know much about it. But liberals like Nussbaum will argue that it's not the sex part of selling sex that makes it problematic. It's all the other parts. So the liberals agrees with the picture of male domination, but they say the problem is the system, right? If you fix that, sex work wouldn't be a problem. If women had power, then giving the autonomy and the freedom to sell, um, sell sex wouldn't be degrading, right? It would just be another option for them. So it's just that it's placed in the system is what makes it bad. It's not the sex itself, claims Nussbaum and the liberals. So the rules argue that making sex work legal, kind of just straightforwardly in a simple sense, increases a woman's autonomy by giving her one more thing that she can do. Right? Um, Now, Anderson is going to argue that the situation is not straightforward, right? And it doesn't increase your autonomy. Often, more options can reduce your autonomy. Uh, in particular, when some service, some work that you can perform becomes a commercial commodity, gets tied up in a whole world of like things like contracts, certain assumptions, certain implicit um, incentives and demands that normally we don't tie up with sex. And he argues would be there, that's for good reason, right? So, I expect to be paid for teaching this course, right? Um, and you expect to be taught, right, uh, business ethics in exchange. A client of a masseuse expects a massage in exchange for their money and so on. And typically in our society, we don't treat sex that way. Sex is sort of out of bounds of the commercial world. And Anderson wants to say there's a good reason for that. It's a different sort of thing and we want it to stay different. Right? So, for example, even if a woman goes out on a date with a man and he pays a lot of money for her dinner and spends a lot of money on this date, um, it's clear legally and hopefully morally for everyone that that doesn't constitute any sort of contract for sex, even implicitly, right? The woman can walk away from the date and say, "Thank you very much. No, I don't want to kiss you or touch you or do anything with you," and we can't fault her morally or legally for that. Um, so Anderson says, in order to demonstrate why sex is different, let's take Nussbaum at her word, right? And let's assume, as she argues, that sex is really no different than singing or chicken plucking or all those other um, occupations, right, that she described when she was comparing them all with sex work, apart from just our prejudices. So let's imagine a world where sex is treated just like any other commodity, right? Um, and let's see what follows from that and see if that's really a world you want, right? So, in that sort of world, sex might be enforceable by contracts, either explicit or implicit. It's just going to be another bargaining chip in everyday commerce. And so Anderson lays out a series of consequences in several categories. So category A is in this world where, sex is just another commodity to be bought and sold, new incentives to have sex are going to arise that we're not used to having to deal with. So sexual duties might be added to someone's job description, right? So in addition to typing or cleaning the kitchen or building the house or whatever, you may also, part of your job may become providing sex for someone, an employer or an employee or a client or something like that, right? Again, we're imagining Nussbaum's world where like, we've gotten over our prejudices and our hangups about sex, right? So now, okay, maybe that's part of your contract when you signed a job, okay, you're gonna file these reports and then you have to have sex with Andrew or whoever. And like, um, number two, uh, welfare agencies might take this into account that women have the option to do sex work, right? There's often like work requirements for receiving, aid. Um, and so we could imagine that, again, welfare agencies would say, well, um, before we can give you any money, have you tried sex work, right? Are you applying for jobs as, as a prostitute? We need to see some evidence that you've been, trying to do work. and sex work will be on that list, right? That seems, again, he's assuming that all these will feel wrong to you, right? Um, and number three, people might sign and courts would have to enforce contracts that include a requirement of sexual services, be it an employment contract or some other contract, that uh, for any wide range of things, right? But we would have courts saying, sorry, you have to have sex with Andrew. I don't know why I'm saying Andrew. So again, these would all be kind of new ways that you would be sort of required or encouraged to have sex in ways that you normally are not required or encouraged to, and that might Anderson thinks that's going to feel weird. Category B, control over sexual practices. So, you know, large corporations would get into the sex selling business if this was, considered moral and legal. And so they would introduce their standard practices, right? If you work in an Amazon warehouse or at a McDonald's, you are supervised constantly. You are told, right, on a very precise time schedule, when you take your breaks, right? How fast it's supposed to take to flip a burger, to move a box, and so on. And that would be applied to the practice of sex, right? So you would have Amazon managing um, its house of prostitution, basically, right? That seems maybe strange. Number five, workers who are performing sexual duties would have to abide by the laws against discrimination, meaning you wouldn't be able to turn down any clients for sex, right, on the basis of whatever it might be, gender, race, right, ability, and so on, right? So, maybe you would not want to have homosexual sex or would not want to have heterosexual sex, but you might be required to, um, because otherwise that would be discriminatory. Um, Number six, again, if sex is, if Nussbaum says our hang-ups of sex are gone and it's um, just another job, then the government would be also involved in inspecting the health and sexual practices of employees, making sure they're all legal and healthy and not spreading disease or anything like that. And that might feel weird to have the government involved in your sex. And finally, category C thinks that there would also be additional new pressures on sexual attitudes and values. So again, if sex is legal and considered moral in a society and large corporations get into the sex business, they're going to want to advertise, they're going to want to market, and they're going to be trying to push their product, which is sex, right? And so they're going to be advertising heavily with an aim to normalize sex outside of relationships and sex outside of marriage, right? Um, a monogamous relationship is not good for business, right? For a big sex corporation, right? So there's going to be constant pressure for people's to again go go outside the marriage and the relationships for sex, which you might not think is a positive influence. Um, High schools and colleges and other, institutions that are involved in job training will have to take sex worker as, one of the list of jobs, right? And so your high school counselor may say, "Here, take this aptitude test. Looks like you might be a good sex worker, right? You should consider sex work, maybe, right?" Um, Funneling graduates into these careers, there would maybe be a department at the University of Sex Work. So, Anderson's obviously this is kind of a weird sort of sci-fi kind of thought experiment, right? Anderson's saying that that's not necessarily all going to happen if sex work is legalized. Again, it's a thought experiment. It's meant to test Nussbaum's claim that sex is just another commodity, right? And he says, are you really willing to go all the way down that road, right? Nussbaum challenges you to say, hey, they used to think singing was immoral. Now singing doesn't seem immoral. So maybe sex is like that. He says, okay, let's really imagine what that entails, right? Are you prepared to treat having sex like, working in a potato chip factory? Or if you find any of these possibilities unsettling, is there a deeper reason for that, right? Is it because sex is different than singing or making potato chips? And I mean, in a nutshell, I'm sort of shortening, I don't know, a good 10 pages here of Anderson gets into. But I think his point is um, sexuality is really, for all of us, for the types of creatures we are and the type of society we're in, deeply tied up in our conception of who we are as people, right? And this is it's so special that it's hard to find another comparison, right? So this is maybe a slightly lame comparison, but imagine you're an artist who's really devoted to your particular thing that you're trying to do, the sculptures you're trying to make, and it matters so much to you that the idea of cheapening, right, or taking a job just painting billboards, just would be terrible to you. You'd rather clean toilets than sort of like, again, this term, prostitute your art, right? Um, if something is that special to you or so central to um, your idea of yourself, uh, we we tend to not want to sell it or cheapen it in some way. And I mean, here I think Anderson is on to something when, to me, that, for example, Nussbaum, right? She describes the colonoscopy artist because she describes all these jobs and none of them involve, you know, being penetrated, right? Their personal space being invaded. And so she brings in the idea of the colonoscopy artist, right? The person that lets makes a living at having colonoscopy equipment tested out on her, and so does have things inserted into her. And I I had trouble with that example because I don't think um, it's the same as sex. It's not the penetration that is the point, right? Sex is something more holistic, um, and sex work does feel different from the other types of work Nussbaum describes because sex is special in our society, and I could imagine a different sort of society where indeed sex is no more central to your identity than shaking hands or something like that. Um, and maybe in that world, in that society, all those issues that Anderson brings up wouldn't be a problem, right? Sure, yeah, write a contract, make me have sex as part of my job or whatever. Um, that just isn't our society. It's just not the types of beings we are, right? It's just, I don't think any of us can imagine any of those things that Anderson lists as something we would want to do or a world we would want to be in. So if Anderson has made his point, and it's up to you, whether you think he has. In this moment, I'm feeling kind of convinced. Pardon me. Um, I mean, there's the further question of what to do about it. So how do we help, actual sex workers? And Anderson argues that, given that sex work is going to exist, right? Even though he doesn't think it should be legal, he doesn't think it's should be considered moral. Um, he does think there are things we can do to help sex workers, right? Because again, he's not so much claiming that sex workers are doing something immoral, that they're bad people, but that the practice itself, right, in an ideal world would not exist. Um, but we're not in an ideal world, so what could we do? So he argues for decriminalization of sex work. So this would mean that, sex workers would not be punished. Sex work would be illegal, but people buying sex would be punished, and the pimps that facilitate it could be punished, right? We've seen similar models in various countries with decriminalization of drug use. So, you know, personal drug users aren't punished, but it's not legal exactly, and the sellers and the pushers are punished, right? So you could see a model like that for prostitution, maybe. Um, and he thinks, that's one way we could improve the material conditions of the sex workers without implicitly supporting the morality or the legality of sex work in general. Okay, so that is Anderson, and then we'll be moving on from the subject on to some other stuff. There'll be a midterm coming up, so yeah, I will see you next time.